Thank you very much. It's an extraordinary honor to have been asked to be this year's Ryerson lecturer, and I'm very grateful to the selection committee for bestowing that honor, to President Randall for that very generous introduction, and of course to the Ryerson family for the gift which makes this possible. It's also a humbling and intimidating prospect, the task of avoiding the disciplinary narrowness of a departmental colloquium paper, and yet also avoiding the windy generalizations more suited to a Bill Moyers interview than a demanding University of Chicago audience. I'm not sure I have accomplished this difficult, if not impossible, task, but I thought I might first approach my topic from the biographical side, as a way of providing some sort of context for the small set of issues I would like to discuss tonight. I would be most often characterized by my profession as a historian of philosophy, especially as a specialist in modern German philosophy from roughly the end of the 18th century to the present. There are some weighty, well-known names in this period: Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, weighty enough and obscure enough to have inspired several hilarious Monty Python comedy sketches. But it is a designation, historian, that some in my profession consider the academic equivalent of librarian of philosophy, or someone designated to take the notes at a meeting or at imagined past meetings, but not to participate. This is because much of contemporary philosophy aspires not to have a history, or at least not to have a history relevant in any philosophical sense. The aspiration is that such a history should be as relevant as the history of chemistry is to chemistry, perhaps of antiquarian interest, but of no real importance to any working chemist today. Literature and art may have living histories. No one would seriously claim that playwriting has so progressed since Shakespeare that Ibsen represents a better version of what Shakespeare was trying in his somewhat backward way to do. But many claim there has been real, indeed decisive progress in philosophy, such that much of the past has been left behind, or if not, must be creatively reinterpreted so as to be made to address contemporary issues. I don't agree with the conventional view of what a historian of philosophy is, and I want to talk tonight about the historical location of philosophical activity, especially recently, among the bourgeoisie. But I note first that my daughter was at least going in a better direction on this issue when she was about 8, and I overheard her being asked by a friend, "What does your father do for a living?" And she responded, "Oh, he steals ideas from dead people." The friend naturally enough asked, "Why doesn't he think up any of his own?" And my daughter defended a version of my own answer. "He says all the best ones have already been thought up, but we don't really understand yet what they mean, and we have to think about them some more." Her friend didn't note that this is a somewhat paradoxical response, much like the apocryphal restaurant complaint. The food is terrible there, and they don't give you enough of it. I should say that my son's stock response to this question is somewhat different. He sits in front of the computer all day and orders things from Amazon. None of these characterizations is altogether false, although I would call the Amazon hunting pure research. But many of the German philosophers I'm interested in would answer somewhat differently because they believe there is an essential relation between philosophy and its historical time, and that to understand that historical aspect of philosophy in our own time, we need to say something about how that relation manifested itself in the prior epochs out of which ours developed. The idea is that although there are any number of what seem like straightforward philosophical issues in our contemporary world, we can be led astray if we simply charge ahead and start trying to solve the problems. Moreover, as opposed to many once standard problems in philosophy that have pretty much died out, like proofs for the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, these current problems continue to have a historical life, we might say, because of complex and often hidden links with non-philosophical issues, links that become apparent only by locating the philosophy of a time in the right historical narrative, something that's not possible by attention to academic philosophical issues alone. Or so goes the kind of claim I'm interested in tonight. There are scores of controversies about everything I've just said, the key issue being what one might mean by develop out of the past, and what distinguishing a living notion or practice from a dead or dying one amounts to. But for the sake of context, we should also note that there are numerous possible positions here about what it is for philosophy to have a history, and it's easy to get lost quickly. There's straight progressivism, especially for philosophers who link modern philosophy to the discoveries of modern natural science, and regard past philosophy the same way they regard past religion, as bad and now superseded science. Indeed, many of the thinkers we take to be the founders of a distinctly modern philosophy, like Hobbes or Descartes, clearly believed that so much had changed that philosophy itself simply had to begin all over again, from scratch. There are then the perennialists, who think there is a small, permanent core of philosophical problems, like why should anyone care about justice if they can get away with unjustly bettering their own lot? And each generation has its own go at it, failing to make much progress, just like all the other generations, but captured by the problems nonetheless. This is, of course, the position, or perhaps one should say, given its great success at the time, the marketing strategy of the Great Books program, so associated with Mortimer Adler and the Hutchins era at the University of Chicago. And there are various kinds of relativists who see philosophical problems as bound up with their age so much that they should be thought of as games and puzzles or anxieties or obsessions that arise for a while in a certain period, like literary or painting or musical styles, and then change and fade away as times change. Perhaps Wittgenstein's phrase is apt here, philosophy as conceptual music. It's quite likely that, in a way, all of these answers are correct, some for certain sorts of problems, some for others. At any rate, I am some sort of partisan of the narrative, historical meaning, and historical authority camp alluded to above, where it is appropriate, and I think it is appropriate in far more contexts than generally accepted. But stated so broadly, this doesn't tell us much. Most everyone is willing to concede that the concepts by which we explain and evaluate our experience are historically conditioned in some sense. As with everything else, the devil is in the details. I want to talk today about just one such detailed problem and its historical fate, the ideal of freedom, especially an understanding of what it is to lead one's own life in such a way that it requires protection of basic entitlements for individuals, like property rights, and that understands human agency as resulting in actions by individuals for which they may be held individually responsible. Even though these questions, what is the real content of this ideal? What would it be to lead a free life? And why has it become so important to us? What is its importance? Are obviously pretty vague. It already doesn't look likely that a strictly philosophical answer to these questions could get us very far. At least it doesn't seem likely to me. It's, after all, only relatively recently in Western history that we began to think of human beings as something like individuals directing and guiding the course of their own existence, in some sense independent and self-determining centers of a causal agency. Only relatively recently that one's entitlement to such a self-determining, self-directed life seemed not just valuable, but absolutely valuable. For the most part, more important even than any consideration of security, well-being, and peace that would make the attainment of such an ideal more difficult, that it was even worth the risk of life in its defense. At least this moral, quasi-religious insistence on the value of individual liberty has attained this level of importance in the United States, somewhat distinct from continental Europe. Its legitimacy is not so much defended by appeals to self-interest, or our collectively being better off by its adoption, but by appeals to a kind of absolute moral entitlement. This is one of the reasons why the great American political philosopher John Rawls found such a large American audience for his Kantian defense of freedom as an essential element in justice. The claim for importance actually has a lot to do with the claim by Rousseau that has also found generations of passionate adherents, that there is a condition necessary for a life to have any value for me, that it be my life, that nothing can be a good for me unless it is a good to me, recognized as such by me, under conditions that allow the recognition and evaluation to be truly mine. It seems unlikely in the extreme that this notion of freedom and its most important political implication, the idea of a human or natural right, should have simply been waiting around in history unnoticed, waiting for Locke and Rousseau to discover it. We can try to quarantine, as it were, the philosophical issues, arguing that however such an ideal got on our agenda is of no importance to philosophy, and we just investigate its rational credentials once history hands it to us. But that seems quite disingenuous, since the notion has a kind of historical and social authority and a